December 22, 1944, 1447. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich stood by a map in his command post in Le Glaise and smiled. His 6th SS Panzer Army had advanced 60 kilometers deep into American defenses. In front of him lay reports of panic among enemy troops, of entire divisions retreating in disorder. "Americans are not soldiers," he told his chief of staff. "They are merchants playing at war. When it comes to real battle, they run." 800 kilometers to the south, in the town of Nancy, General George Patton looked at the same map, but his face showed not smugness, but cold fury. His Third Army was preparing for the most incredible maneuver in modern military history. "In 48 hours, Patton told his commanders, "we will pivot the entire army 90 degrees and strike a blow the Germans will never forget." 4 days later, Dietrich was no longer smiling. His invincible SS army was encircled, and the Americans he had so despised were writing new rules of blitzkrieg. This is the story of how mockery turned into nightmare, and how Hitler's greatest gamble became Patton's greatest triumph. On December 16, 1944, at 05:30 a.m., the silence of the Ardennes forests was shattered by the thunder of 1,000 guns. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate attempt to change the course of the war, had begun. 200,000 German soldiers, 600 tanks, 1,900 guns crashed down on an 80-kilometer front defended by just 4 American divisions. It was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. Hitler had chosen for his final strike the same place where, 4 years earlier, his armies had broken through to the Channel and crushed the French. The Ardennes, difficult terrain with dense forests and narrow roads, seemed the perfect place for a surprise attack. The American command considered this sector quiet and stationed its least experienced units here. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived at the front only 2 weeks earlier. The 28th Infantry Division was recovering from heavy fighting in the Hürtgen Forest. The first hours of the offensive seemed brilliant for the Germans. American units, caught off guard, retreated in panic. Entire battalions surrendered. On the first day, the Germans advanced 20 kilometers. In Berlin, euphoria reigned. Goebbels prepared a proclamation of a second Dunkirk. Wehrmacht generals, who had been retreating for months, suddenly believed in the possibility of victory. But in the Allied headquarters at Versailles, the atmosphere was entirely different. General Eisenhower realized the Germans had bet everything they had left. This was not a tactical diversion. It was a strategic gamble that could either prolong the war by a year or end it forever. And so Eisenhower made the boldest decision of his career. He called Patton. The plan for Operation Wacht am Rhein was born in the German headquarters in the fall of 1944, out of desperation and unrealistic hopes. Hitler, squeezed between the advancing Red Army in the east and the Allies in the west, sought a way to radically change the situation. On September 16, 1944, the Führer summoned Colonel General Alfred Jodl and announced a plan that shocked even this seasoned staff officer. German forces were to break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. "If we manage to take Antwerp," Hitler said, tracing his finger across the map, "the British and Americans will be divided. They'll have to make a separate peace with us, and then we can throw everything against the Bolsheviks." The plan looked grandiose on paper. 3 armies, the 5th and 6th SS Panzer armies plus the 7th Army, were to cover 150 kilometers to Antwerp in just 4 days. For this, Hitler concentrated the Reich's last strategic reserves, 12 panzer divisions, including the most elite SS units, but Jodl and other generals saw obvious problems. The Germans lacked fuel. Each panzer division had ammunition and supplies for only 150 kilometers. The Luftwaffe could field at most 800 aircraft against 4,000 Allied. And most importantly, the Americans were no longer the inexperienced novices defeated at Kasserine in 1943. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander of the Western Front, called the operation a grand fantasy. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had to command the offensive directly, asked to scale it down, but Hitler was adamant. "This operation is our last chance," he said. "Either we break the Allies now, or we lose the war entirely." Preparation for the operation proceeded in strict secrecy. The codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was intended to create the impression that the Germans were preparing for defense, not attack. Troop movements took place only at night. Radio communication was forbidden. Officers swore oaths of silence under threat of execution. By December 15th, the Germans had concentrated 200,000 men, 600 tanks and assault guns, 1,900 artillery pieces in the Ardennes. It was the largest concentration of German forces on the Western Front since the Normandy invasion. Facing them, the Americans had only 83,000 soldiers in 4 divisions. The U.S. command considered the Ardennes too difficult for large-scale operations. General Troy H. Middleton's 8th Corps held the sector with green and battered units. German officer Troy Führer von Freytag described the mood in American trenches before the attack. The Yanks played cards, listened to jazz on the radio, and dreamed of Christmas at home. They had no idea what awaited them. On December 16, 1944 at 0530, German artillery opened the heaviest barrage on the Western Front since D-Day. 1,900 guns simultaneously rained fire on American positions along an 80-kilometer front. Private James McNamara of the 99th Infantry Division later recalled, "I'd been in the infantry for 2 years, but I had never seen such hell. The ground jumped under our feet. Trees fell like matchsticks. It felt like the world was ending. But the artillery preparation lasted only 90 minutes. The Germans could not afford to expend more ammunition. They simply didn't have the reserves. At 0700, the infantry assault began, supported by tanks. The first blows fell on the 14th Cavalry Group and the 106th Infantry Division. These units were the least experienced in General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps. The 106th had arrived at the front only on December 11th and had not yet fully prepared positions. The German offensive followed the classic blitzkrieg pattern. Tanks infiltrated weak spots in the defense, while infantry mopped up strong points left behind. The heaviest blows came from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, on the northern flank, and the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, in the center. By noon, the situation for the Americans was critical. 2 regimental combat teams of the 106th Division, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, were encircled near the village of Schönberg. It was the largest American pocket since Bastogne. Colonel George Deschênes, commander of the 422nd, tried to break out, but German tanks already controlled all the roads. At 1630, he received an order from Division Command. Hold positions at all costs. Help is on the way. But no help came. General Alan Jones, commander of the 106th, had lost contact with half his units. His headquarters in St. Vith turned into chaos. Telephones rang constantly. Couriers rushed in with conflicting reports, and the situation map became a mosaic of red blotches. Meanwhile, German panzer units pushed deeper into American defenses. The battle group of SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division advanced 25 kilometers and seized the village of Bühlingen. Here occurred the first major tragedy of the battle. An American column, medics and service troops, ran into Peiper's tanks near Malmedy. 84 Americans surrendered, but Peiper's SS men executed the prisoners in a field. This event, remembered as the Malmedy Massacre, became a symbol of the brutality of the Ardennes battle. By the end of the day, the Germans had advanced 20 kilometers along the front. In American headquarters, confusion reigned. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the 1st Army, for the first time in the war, lost control of the situation. December the 17th was the darkest day for American forces in the Battle of the Ardennes. The German offensive spread like an oil stain, engulfing more and more territory. By noon, it became clear. This was not a local diversion, but a full-scale offensive. At St. Vith, a key transport hub, the American defense was cracking. Major General Robert Hasbrouck, commander of the 7th Armored Division, received orders to move immediately to aid encircled units, but his division was scattered along a 30-kilometer front. "I need at least 12 hours to concentrate my forces," Hasbrouck reported by radio. "But I fear that in 12 hours there will be no one left to save. Indeed, the situation of the 422nd and 423rd Regiments was becoming hopeless. Surrounded in the forests near Schönberg, the American soldiers were starving and freezing. The Germans tightened the ring methodically, using artillery and mortars. Private Elmer Clerk of the 423rd Regiment wrote in his diary, "Third day in encirclement. No food, no ammunition. We can't evacuate the wounded. The Germans shouted us to surrender, promised good treatment. The boys are starting to crack." On December 19th, the resistance of the 422nd and 423rd Regiments ended. 7,000 American soldiers surrendered. The largest capitulation of U.S. forces in Europe. German propagandists immediately used the event to boost their troops' morale. But not all American units panicked. In the town of Bastogne, a vital road junction, the 101st Airborne Division prepared for siege. These paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had no intention of surrendering without a fight. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the division, received a German ultimatum. Honor demands that you surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. McAuliffe's reply became legendary. Nuts. Meanwhile, German panzer divisions pressed forward. Piper's battle group reached the village of Stavelot, only 10 kilometers from a massive American fuel depot at Spa. Had the SS captured it, they would have had enough fuel to reach the Meuse. But here the Germans met American ingenuity. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrall's engineer company rigged every bridge on Piper's route with explosives. When German tanks approached Stavelot, the Americans blew up the bridge over the Amblève River. Piper was trapped. Ahead, a destroyed bridge and American anti-tank guns. Behind, other U.S. units already launching counterattacks. Ammunition and fuel were running out. "We are in a position where every hour may be our last," Piper noted in his war diary. "The Americans are proving much tougher opponents than we expected." By day's end, it was clear. The German advance was losing momentum. Heroic resistance by isolated American garrisons, destroyed bridges, and fuel shortages were all slowing the German push. On December 19th, 1944 at 10:30 a.m., the phone rang in the 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy. General George Patton picked up and heard the voice of the Supreme Commander. "George, the situation in the Ardennes is critical. I need your army." Eisenhower explained succinctly. The Germans had broken through 60 kilometers. 2 U.S. divisions were destroyed. Bastogne was under siege. "How long will it take you to turn your army north?" he asked. 48 hours, Patton replied without hesitation. "Give me 48 hours and I'll attack." Eisenhower paused. What Patton was proposing seemed impossible. The Third Army was deployed eastward, preparing to cross the Saar River. Now it had to pivot 90 degrees and march 150 kilometers north, in the middle of winter, on icy roads. Any other general would have asked for a week to regroup. Patton promised 48 hours. "All right," Eisenhower said. "Do it." Patton hung up the receiver and turned to his staff. Chief of Staff Major General Hugh Gaffey shook his head at the map. "Boss, it's impossible. We've got 133,000 men, 800 tanks, 500 guns. How can we move them in 2 days?" "Gaffey," Patton smiled, "you haven't yet seen what a real army can do. You're about to." For the next 2 hours, the Third Army headquarters buzzed with feverish activity. Planning officers drew up routes for hundreds of columns. Communications officers organized radio nets. Supply officers calculated fuel and ammunition needs. At 1 p.m., Patton gathered his division commanders. "Gentlemen," he said, "we face the toughest operation of the war. We must turn the entire army north and strike the Germans in 48 hours. Who thinks this is impossible?" No one raised a hand. The commanders of the Third Army knew their old blood and guts. When Patton made a promise, he kept it. "Excellent," Patton continued. The 4th Armored Division moves to Arlon, the 26th Infantry to Luxembourg, the 80th Infantry to Mersch. The march begins today at 1800. Questions? Major General Hugh Gaffey, commander of the 4th Armored, raised his hand. "Sir, what about supplies? We'll be cutting ourselves off from bases." "Supplies will come," Patton replied firmly. "I've arranged with the French. They're giving us all their depots. Plus, Army aviation will drop ammo from the air." At 1800, Patton's Third Army began the fastest redeployment in modern military history. Across the frozen roads of France and Luxembourg moved hundreds of columns of tanks, guns, and trucks. 133,000 soldiers marched toward destiny. The night of December 20th was hellish for Patton's soldiers. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, and the roads became ice rinks. Hundreds of columns moved in darkness, guided only by blackout headlights. Sergeant Mike O'Connor of the 4th Armored Division later wrote to his wife, "We marched all night on frozen roads. Tanks skidded, trucks slid into ditches, but nobody stopped. Patton said 48 hours, so 48 hours it will be." The logistical challenge was staggering. The Third Army had 15,000 vehicles, from tanks to field kitchens. All had to be moved 150 kilometers without losing combat effectiveness. Colonel Walter Mueller, head of the Army Movement Section, devised a detailed plan. Roads were divided into corridors. Armored divisions took the main highways, infantry the secondary roads, artillery and support units the back roads. Each column had a precise schedule. Tanks, 25 kilometers per hour on highways, 15 kilometers per hour on dirt roads. Trucked infantry, 30 kilometers per hour. Artillery on tractors, 20 kilometers per hour. Stops only for refueling and maintenance. French gendarmes directed traffic at intersections. American military police controlled the main routes. Engineer battalions cleared snow and spread sand on icy stretches. But the greatest challenge was concealment. German air reconnaissance must not discover the Third Army's redeployment, so movement took place only at night, with columns hiding in forests by day. On December 20th at 1400, the first units of the 4th Armored Division reached the area of Arlon, only 30 kilometers from Bastogne. It was fantastically fast, 150 kilometers in 20 hours. Major General Gaffey immediately set up his command post and radioed Patton, "Sir, the vanguard is in place, ready for battle." "Excellent, you," Patton replied. "Now show the Germans what American speed really means." Meanwhile, the 26th Infantry Division of General Willard Paul reached positions near Luxembourg City. The 80th Infantry Division of General Horace McBride assembled in the Mersch area. In 36 hours, Patton had moved 133,000 men and 15,000 vehicles. It was the fastest strategic redeployment of an army in all of World War II. German command had no idea that an entire army was approaching from the south, but Patton had no intention of stopping. On December 21st at 0600, he gave the order, "We attack today. No artillery preparation, no probing attacks. Just forward and tear their guts out." The Third Army prepared for the boldest counterattack in its history. On December 22nd, 1944 at 0600 a.m., the silence of the Ardennes morning was broken by the roar of tank engines. Patton's 4th Armored Division of the Third Army launched a counterattack from the south against German positions. Major General Hugh Gaffey deployed his division in classic formation, tank battalions in front, motorized infantry on half-tracks behind them, self-propelled artillery on the flanks. 160 Sherman tanks and 80 self-propelled guns pushed northward. The Germans were caught completely off guard. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, who only yesterday had mocked the American shopkeepers, now frantically tried to shift reserves to meet the new threat. "Where did they get an entire army?" he shouted over the radio to his chief of staff. 3 days ago, they were running in panic, and now they're attacking with 3 divisions at once. The first clash took place near the village of Martelange. The German 5th Parachute Regiment had dug in among stone houses and prepared to repel a frontal assault. But the Americans attacked differently than the Fallschirmjäger expected. Instead of striking head-on, Sherman tanks split into small groups and encircled the village from 3 directions simultaneously. Self-propelled M7 Priest howitzers fired direct rounds into buildings while infantry advanced under cover of smoke screens. Within 2 hours, Martelange was liberated. German losses: 340 killed and wounded, 180 captured. American losses: 23 killed and 67 wounded. The casualty ratio spoke for itself, but the greatest effect was psychological. German soldiers, who only yesterday had felt like victors, suddenly realized they were the ones being attacked, and attacked so quickly and decisively that resistance seemed futile. SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Stolz of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "The Americans attack like madmen. Their tanks are everywhere, in front, on the flanks, behind. It seems they have endless reserves. We have only what remains after 5 days of assault." By noon, the 4th Armored Division had advanced 8 kilometers and reached the approaches to Bastogne. Here the Americans faced heavy resistance. The Germans rushed in the 15th Panzergrenadier Division and the 5th Parachute Division. The fiercest battle of the counterattack began. German Panthers and Tigers clashed with American Shermans in open terrain. Technically, the German tanks were superior, but the Americans had the advantage in numbers and, most importantly, logistics. When a German tank was knocked out, its crew often had nowhere to retreat. When an American Sherman was lost, another rolled forward within an hour. Patton's supplies of fuel and ammunition seemed inexhaustible. Captain James Levison, a tank company commander, recalled, "We lost 12 tanks in one day, but by evening we received 15 replacements. The Germans lost 8 and got none. The arithmetic of war was on our side." By the end of December 22nd, the German ring around Bastogne was pierced from the south. The 4th Armored Division established a narrow corridor to the besieged stronghold. The 101st Airborne Division was saved. December 23rd brought a change in the weather that completely shifted the balance of power. The fog lifted, the sky cleared, and American air power could finally enter the battle. At 0830, the first P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over the battlefield. Each heavy fighter bomber carried 10 HVAR rockets and 500-pound bombs. German armored columns stood out as easy targets against the snow-covered fields. Major Robert S. Johnson, ace of the 56th Fighter Group, led the first strike. We saw the perfect picture beneath us. German tanks and trucks strung out along the road for kilometers. It was like a shooting gallery. On the first day of air operations, the Germans lost 89 tanks and assault guns, plus over 200 vehicles and tractors. It was a blow from which the Panzer divisions never recovered. But on the ground, the fighting only intensified. Encouraged by the success at Bastogne, Patton ordered the offensive expanded. The 26th Infantry Division attacked toward Wiltz, while the 80th Infantry pushed on Edelbruck. The fiercest battle erupted for the town of Diekirch. This small Luxembourgish town became the key to the entire German position in the southern sector of the Bulge. Whoever held Diekirch controlled the main communications of the German force. The Germans pulled in the 352nd Infantry Division and remnants of the 276th Infantry Division. Defense was commanded by experienced Colonel Erich Schmidt, a veteran of the Eastern Front. "This town is the key to our southern flank," Schmidt told his men. "If the Americans take it, the whole 7th Army risks encirclement." The attack on Diekirch was led by Colonel Harry Flanagan of the 80th Infantry Division. His plan was simple but effective. Diversionary attacks from the west and east, with the main strike from the north, where the Germans least expected it. The battle began at 0500 on December 24th. American 105mm howitzers shelled German positions for an hour, after which 3 infantry battalions advanced with tank support. The Germans resisted desperately. Every house became a fortress, every street a defensive line. The Americans fought house by house, room by room. Sergeant Frank Peterson of the 317th Infantry Regiment recalled, "It was like hell. The Germans sat in cellars with machine guns and Panzerfausts. Any room could be your last. But we pushed forward because we knew Patton was behind us." By the end of the day, the Americans held half the town. The Germans fell back to the center and entrenched themselves in a 14th century stone church. From there, they continued firing on U.S. troops. Flanagan called for reinforcements, a battery of 155mm howitzers. 2 direct hits reduced the ancient church to rubble. German resistance collapsed. On Christmas Day, December 25th, Diekirch was fully liberated. The southern flank of the German Bulge began to crumble. December 25th, 1944, entered history as the Christmas miracle of Patton's Third Army. On the day when all of Christian Europe celebrated the birth of Christ, American soldiers received the best gift. the chance to win. At 0600 a.m., Patton personally arrived at the forward command post of the 4th Armored Division near Bastogne. He wanted to assess the situation himself and plan the next phase of the counterattack. "Gentlemen," he told his commanders, "the Germans have given us the best Christmas present. They poured out of their fortifications and let themselves be destroyed in the open field. Now it's our turn to hand out gifts." The situation truly favored the Americans. In 4 days of counterattacks, the Third Army had advanced 20 kilometers, liberated Bastogne, and captured key towns. Most importantly, the German initiative was gone for good. SS Obergruppenführer Dietrich, who a week earlier had dreamed of a second Dunkirk, now feverishly looked for ways to save his divisions from destruction. His 6th SS Panzer Army had lost half its tanks and a third of its manpower. "The Americans no longer fight the way they used to," he reported to Hitler. "They've become faster, bolder, more ruthless. Their Patton has outplayed us all." Indeed, Patton's tactics were radically different from the traditional American approach. Instead of slow preparation and cautious advances, he chose speed and aggression. His tanks struck where least expected. His infantry never paused to consolidate lines. "Speed is everything," Patton repeated. "While the Germans think, we act. While they regroup, we attack. They're playing at war. We're winning it." On December 26th, the Third Army launched a new stage of the offensive. The goal was no longer just to relieve Bastogne, but to encircle and annihilate the entire southern part of the German Bulge. The 4th Armored Division struck northeast, aiming to cut the Bastogne-Uffalise road. The 26th Infantry Division advanced on Wiltz. The 80th Infantry cleared the remaining German resistance in Luxembourg. The fiercest fighting erupted over the village of Cibray, turned into a strong point by the Germans. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had turned every farmhouse into a bunker, every barn into a firing position. But the Americans found an unorthodox solution. Instead of a frontal assault, Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, ordered his Shermans to attack at night with headlights on. "The Germans expect tanks to attack in daylight," Abrams explained. "A night assault with lights will stun them." The gamble worked brilliantly. German anti-tank gunners, blinded by tank beams, couldn't aim. Infantry panicked and abandoned positions. Within 3 hours, Cibray was captured. By the end of December, the German Bulge had turned into a bag. From 3 sides, it was being squeezed by American and British forces. Retreat routes were cut off by artillery and aircraft. On December 27th, confusion bordering on panic reigned in German headquarters. What had seemed a triumphant advance a week earlier was now a catastrophe. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, convened an emergency meeting at his headquarters in Zeve. Reports from division commanders painted a grim picture. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, commander of the 150th Panzer Brigade. "My unit has lost 60% of its equipment. The Americans attack so fast, we can't maneuver." Major General Siegfried Rausch of the 5th Parachute Division. "My division is scattered. Regiments have no contact with each other. American artillery fires around the clock." Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr Division. "I have 18 tanks left out of 80, fuel for 1 day, ammunition for half a day." Model listened with a stony face. The virtuoso tactician who had held back the Red Army for 2 years now stood powerless before the American onslaught. "The problem isn't that the Americans got better," he told his chief of staff. "The problem is that we got worse. Our soldiers are exhausted, our equipment worn, and we have no reserves." Indeed, the divisions taking part in the offensive were shadows of the Wehrmacht's past glory. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, was manned by boys of 16 to 17. The 276th Infantry Division was filled with 40 to 50-year-old reservists. Even the elite 1st SS Panzer Division suffered from a shortage of experienced officers. Meanwhile, Patton prepared the final blow. On December 28th, he summoned his corps commanders and unveiled Operation Thunderbolt. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Germans are stuck in the Ardennes like a fly in a web. Time to shut the trap for good." The plan was daring and risky. The Third Army would swing northwest and link with Hodge's First Army advancing from the north. This would form a pocket trapping 3 German armies, but to do so, they had to cover another 40 kilometers through difficult terrain against desperate German defense, all in the dead of winter, with temperatures plunging to minus 20 degrees Celsius. "Sir," said Major General Eddy, commander of 13th Corps, "what if the Germans manage to retreat?" "They won't," Patton smiled. "Hitler won't let them. He'll order them to hold to the last, and that will be his last mistake." On December 29th, Operation Thunderbolt began. 3 corps of the 3rd Army struck northwest. The 4th Armored pushed toward Bastogne. The 6th Armored attacked Warden. The 11th Armored advanced on Houffalize. German resistance was desperate but disorganized. Their scattered divisions couldn't support one another. The Americans used their mobility, striking where the enemy was weakest. By the end of the day, the Bulge had shrunk by another 15 kilometers. German losses: over 8,000 men and 150 tanks. American losses: 890 men and 23 tanks. On January 1st, 1945, Patton received an intelligence report that intrigued him. The Germans had deployed a battalion of heavy tanks, 14 King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world. These 70-ton monsters, armed with an 88mm gun, were practically invulnerable to standard American tanks. A single King Tiger could wipe out an entire company of Shermans without taking damage. "Interesting," Patton said to his intelligence chief. "So the Germans want to test their toys against us. Let's see how that works out." On January 2nd, the King Tigers of the 501st SS Heavy Tank Battalion entered combat near the village of Non-Mit. Opposing them was the 8th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, 17 Shermans under Lieutenant Colonel Jenk Richardson. On paper, it looked like David versus Goliath. The Sherman weighed 32 tons and mounted a 76mm gun, effective against a King Tiger only at less than 500 meters. The King Tiger could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters, but Richardson was a veteran of the African campaign. He knew, in tank battles, the winner is not the one with the better tank, but the one with the better tactics. "Listen carefully," he told his crews over the radio. "We won't fight them head-on. We'll hunt like wolves, in a pack, fast, unexpected." Richardson split his battalion into 4 groups of 4 tanks each. One group would draw German fire with a frontal demonstration. The 2nd and 3rd would flank. The 4th would strike from the rear. The battle began at 14:30. The German Tigers, positioned on a hill, methodically destroyed American tanks. In 5 minutes, they knocked out 3 Shermans without loss. But then, the American tactic worked. While the Germans focused on the frontal group, the flanking group struck their weaker side armor. The side armor was far less resistant than the thick frontal plate. The result stunned even the Americans. In 40 minutes, they destroyed 8 King Tigers while losing 6 Shermans. The cost ratio was staggering. 1 King Tiger was worth 5 Shermans. Most importantly, it was a crushing psychological blow. The Germans' most powerful weapon was not invincible after all. The Americans proved that even technical superiority doesn't save you if the enemy outthinks you. SS Obersturmbannführer Johann Pfeffer, commander of the 501st Battalion, radioed, "The Americans fight completely differently now. They are smarter, faster, bolder. Our Tigers were beaten not by machines, but by tactics." On January 3rd, Patton personally inspected the wrecks. Walking among the smoldering hulks of King Tigers, he uttered the phrase that became famous. "It doesn't matter how big and powerful your tank is. What matters is who sits inside." On January 8, 1945, Hitler finally made the hardest decision of his military career. He authorized a retreat from the Ardennes. 22 days of bloody fighting had shown that Germany's last gamble had failed. But the German retreat was no less dramatic than the offensive. Under constant attacks by American aircraft and artillery, trudging along icy roads, abandoning equipment and severely wounded men, 3 German armies struggled back toward the Siegfried Line. Patton had no intention of letting the Germans withdraw peacefully. "They came as uninvited guests," he said. "Now, let them pay for it." On January 9th through 10th, the 3rd Army struck at retreating German columns. American aircraft operated day and night, turning German marches into bloody nightmares. Major Gerhard Engel of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote in his diary, This isn't a retreat, it's a rout. Wrecked vehicles everywhere, bodies everywhere. American planes hunt us like rabbits. Discipline is collapsing. On January 16th, the spearheads of the U.S. 3rd and 1st Armies met near Houffalize. The Bulge was eliminated. The Battle of the Ardennes ended in complete Allied victory. The results were catastrophic for Germany. The Wehrmacht lost 67,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, 700 tanks and assault guns, and 1,600 aircraft. These had been the Reich's last strategic reserves. American losses were 19,000 men and 733 tanks. But unlike the Germans, the U.S. could replace such losses in a matter of weeks. Field Marshal Rundstedt, assessing the outcome of the battle, uttered the phrase that became the epitaph of the Third Reich. After the Ardennes, we have no resources left for strategic operations. From now on, we can only retreat and await the end. But the worst blow for Germany was not material, but moral. Their final attempt to change the course of the war had collapsed with a crash. Wehrmacht soldiers who, in December, still believed in possible victory, now knew. The war was lost for good. Patton, by contrast, was at the peak of glory. In 26 days of fighting, his Third Army had marched 150 kilometers, destroyed 4 German divisions, and liberated dozens of towns. On January 16th, Eisenhower personally visited the Third Army headquarters to congratulate Patton. "George," he said, "what you did in the Ardennes will go down in history as one of the greatest feats of the U.S. Armed Forces." When the Battle of the Ardennes ended, it was time to take stock and analyze the mistakes. Why did Germany's last gamble fail so catastrophically? Why were armies that had once triumphed on every front now powerless against the Americans? The chief error of German command was underestimating the enemy. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to victories from 1939 through 1942, failed to realize that the U.S. Army of 1944 was fundamentally different from the novices of 1942 through 43. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief intelligence officer, conducted a detailed analysis of German planning for Operation Wacht am Rhein. His conclusions were striking. The Germans planned this operation using the logic of 1940. They expected the Americans to panic and retreat like the French had 4 years earlier. But the Americans of 1944 were entirely different soldiers. Indeed, in 2.5 years of war, the U.S. Army had developed enormously. Officers had gained experience in Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Soldiers had learned to fight as well as the Germans. American technology and logistics had reached unmatched levels of efficiency. The Germans also underestimated the nature of the Americans themselves. Unlike Europeans, long accustomed to rigid hierarchy, Americans were used to initiative and independence. When a commander was killed, a sergeant took command. When the sergeant fell, a private stepped up. This trait proved decisive in the chaos of the Ardennes. German soldiers, cut off from their command, often lost the will to fight. Americans, in the same situation, only fought harder. American technological superiority also played a crucial role. By 1944, U.S. industry was at its peak. A lost tank could be replaced within hours, a downed plane within a day, a fallen pilot within a week. The Germans, in contrast, were fighting at the limits of their resources. Each Tiger tank lost was irreplaceable. Each Me-262 shot down was a catastrophe. Experienced pilots and tank crews were worth their weight in gold. But Hitler's greatest mistake was his strategic delusion. He planned the Ardennes offensive as a turning point that would force the Western Allies into a separate peace with Germany. This was pure illusion. By the end of 1944, the Allies already saw the end of the war approaching and were preparing for post-war settlements. No tactical setback could persuade them to compromise with the Nazi regime. General Omar Bradley, a commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, put it bluntly. Hitler lived in a world of illusions. He thought we were like the French in 1940. But we didn't come for glory or territory. We came to destroy Nazism forever. The Germans also miscalculated the psychological factor. The Malmedy massacre, where SS troops executed American prisoners, only hardened Allied resolve. Instead of fear and hesitation, it gave the Americans new motivation to fight to the finish. Sergeant Kurt von Kalt of the 285th Infantry Regiment wrote in his diary, "When we heard about Malmedy, the mood in the companies changed overnight. Before, we saw the Germans as ordinary soldiers following orders. Now, we saw them as murderers who had to be destroyed." Operation Wacht am Rhein revealed another fatal weakness of German strategy: total dependence on the Führer himself. Hitler personally planned the operation, personally appointed commanders, and personally forbade retreat even when situations became hopeless. A system built on the cult of one man proved fatally fragile. When the Führer's decisions were wrong, they could not be corrected. No one dared oppose the greatest commander of all time. The American command system, in contrast, rested on collegiality and professionalism. Eisenhower consulted his subordinates. Patton listened to his staff. Division commanders had freedom of initiative. The result was inevitable. A flexible American system defeated a rigid German hierarchy. To fully grasp the scale of the American victory in the Ardennes, it's worth analyzing in detail what Patton achieved with his Third Army. Military historians regard this operation as one of the greatest examples of operational art in the 20th century. First, Patton demonstrated unmatched speed of reaction. From Eisenhower's phone call to the launch of the attack, only 72 hours passed. In that time, the Third Army pivoted its entire front by 90 degrees and marched 150 kilometers. For comparison, the Germans needed at least a week to redeploy a single army, and the Soviets about 10 days. Patton did it in 3. The secret lay in extraordinary logistical organization. Colonel Walter Müller, chief of movement for the Third Army, designed a system that allowed massive troop movements with minimal traffic jams or delays. Each division had a detailed march route timed to the minute. Each column knew where and when to refuel. Every commander had clear contingency instructions. "Logistics is the art of the possible," Müller said, "and we made the impossible possible." Second, Patton showed mastery in the tactical use of different arms. His armored divisions acted not as blunt iron fists, but as surgical scalpels, slicing through German defenses at their weakest points. Instead of frontal assaults, Patton used flanking maneuvers. Instead of long artillery barrages, he relied on sudden strikes supported by attack aircraft. Instead of cautious advances, he launched rapid breakthroughs with immediate exploitation. Patton fought outside the rules, said Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division. When we expected him to strike from the front, he hit from the flank. When we prepared for a flank attack, he struck from the rear. Third, Patton displayed unique ability to exert psychological pressure on the enemy. His Third Army didn't just advance, it created an atmosphere of inevitable German defeat. Fast breakthroughs, sweeping flanks, sudden blows to the rear, all of it eroded German confidence. Many units surrendered before firing a shot. Patton didn't just fight our soldiers, Field Marshal Model later wrote in his memoirs. He fought our spirit, and in that fight, we lost. Fourth, the American general showed rare talent in coordinating multiple armies. The Ardennes counterattack required close cooperation between Patton's Third Army, Hodge's First Army, and Simpson's Ninth Army. Patton didn't merely execute his assigned role, he actively shaped the actions of neighboring forces. His initiative spurred other commanders to act, creating an avalanche effect. Patton wasn't just an army commander, Eisenhower assessed. He was a catalyst that accelerated everything around him. Finally, Patton revealed an uncommon instinct for seizing the initiative in the harshest conditions. When the Germans attacked in the Ardennes, most American commanders thought of defense. Patton immediately began planning a counterattack. This mindset, always seeking opportunities to strike, made Patton a unique military leader. He didn't react to the enemy's moves, he forced the enemy to react to his. The Battle of the Ardennes ended nearly 80 years ago, yet its lessons remain relevant today. The operation stands both as a textbook on how not to plan strategic offensives and as a model for how to respond to crises. Lesson 1. Underestimating the enemy always leads to disaster. German planners based Operation Wacht am Rhein on outdated views of the U.S. Army, ignoring how much it had changed in 2 years of war. Modern conflicts prove this lesson still holds. Armies that fail to adapt to new realities are doomed, no matter their past victories. Lesson 2. Speed of reaction in a crisis often matters more than perfect planning. Patton lacked time for meticulous preparation, but he had decisiveness and improvisation. In today's even faster wars, battlefield conditions can change in hours. Commanders who waste time on bureaucracy will lose to those who act quickly and boldly. Lesson 3. The psychological factor is as vital as material strength. The Germans had enough force for success in the Ardennes, but after their first setbacks, they lost faith. The Americans, even in their darkest hour, kept confidence. That resilience let them withstand the blow and seize the initiative. Lesson 4. A flexible command system is essential. Germany's rigid hierarchy, with Hitler making every decision, failed in a dynamic situation. The American system, built on delegated authority and initiative, let commanders adapt quickly. Lesson 5. Logistics is critical. The German offensive collapsed largely due to lack of fuel and ammunition. The Americans, by contrast, had virtually unlimited supplies. In modern conflicts, supply chains are even more complex. An army that can't sustain itself will lose regardless of soldiers' heroism. Lesson 6. Technological superiority matters. By 1944, U.S. Boeing's economic advantage lay not only in weapon quality, but in mass production and effective use. Lesson 7. Strategic maturity of leadership is decisive. The Americans saw war as more than battles. It was about destroying Nazi ideology. This vision allowed them to maintain coalition unity even in crisis and fight through to victory. The Ardennes was Germany's last great attempt to alter the war's course. Its failure meant the fate of the Third Reich was sealed. The road to Berlin lay open. When the last fighting in the Ardennes ended in January 1945, it was clear. The world had changed forever. The operation that was supposed to bring Germany a second Dunkirk had become its final disaster. The irony was that German mockery of the Americans became the catalyst for their own defeat. Contempt for the enemy, belief in their own superiority, dismissal of American capabilities. All this led to strategic blindness. On December 16, 1944, SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich had real reason for optimism. His divisions broke through American defenses. Thousands of enemy soldiers surrendered, and the road to Antwerp seemed open. But by December 22nd, that same Dietrich was desperately trying to save what remained of his army. Thus, American merchants had proved such formidable warriors that even elite SS units could not withstand them. What had happened in those 6 days? How did an army retreating in panic seize the initiative and strike a devastating counterblow? The answer: the Germans fought against outdated perceptions, not reality. Their image of the U.S. Army was 2 years out of date. In that time, the Americans had gone from raw novices to professional soldiers. More importantly, the Americans proved a principle. In modern war, victory goes not to those with the proudest traditions, but to those who adapt fastest to new conditions. The German army, burdened with immense historical experience, proved too conservative. The American army, free of dogma and stereotypes, developed new approaches to combat. Patton became the symbol of this new American philosophy of war. His Third Army fought not by academy canon, but by the logic of effectiveness. The goal was results, not adherence to tradition. "I'm not fighting German generals," Patton said. "I'm fighting German soldiers, and my soldiers are better than theirs." This philosophy proved victorious. In 3 weeks of fighting in the Ardennes, the Americans not only repelled the German offensive, they showcased a new model of warfare that became the standard for future conflicts. Speed, flexibility, technological superiority, mastery of logistics, and psychological impact on the enemy. All these elements were united for the first time in one system in the Ardennes. The Germans, by contrast, revealed the danger of clinging to past glories. Blitzkrieg, so effective in 1939 through 41, failed against an enemy that had learned how to counter it. Operation Wacht am Rhein became the swan song of the old European school of war. After the Ardennes, it was clear the future belonged to those who changed quickly and dared to experiment. The American victory in the Ardennes had immense symbolic weight. It proved to the world that the United States was not only an industrial giant, but also a great military power. The European balance of power was changed forever. The era when Europe's armies decided the continent's fate had ended. The American era had begun, and it continues still. The Battle of the Ardennes ended nearly 8 decades ago, yet its echo still resounds. It was not merely a military victory, but a symbol of an epical shift, the transition from the old world to the new. On the morning of December 16, 1944, when German guns thundered through the Ardennes forest, few could have foreseen that this operation would be Europe's last bid to keep its dominance. Germany, heir to centuries of military tradition, wagered everything it had left. Facing it stood the young American army, a force from a country that only 40 years earlier had fought native tribes, but now laid claim to global leadership. The result shocked everyone, including the Americans themselves. In 26 days of combat, it became clear. The future belonged not to those with the longest history, but to those who learned and adapted fastest. Patton and his soldiers revealed a new understanding of war. For them, war was not an art, but a technology. Not ritual, but process. Not a display of national spirit, but a means to achieve concrete goals. This pragmatic philosophy proved stronger than romantic visions of glory. The Americans fought not to prove superiority, but to finish the war quickly and go home. Paradoxically, that unpoetic motivation made them unstoppable. While Germans dreamed of grand victories, Americans methodically dismantled the German war machine, piece by piece. German jokes about American merchants turned out prophetic in an unexpected way. The Americans did approach war like merchants, with calculation, planning, attention to detail, and a drive for maximum efficiency. The result speaks for itself. The merchants crushed the warriors. Technology beat tradition. The future outplayed the past. The Battle of the Ardennes became a moment of truth for Western civilization. It showed leadership passing from the old world to the new, from Europe to America, from aristocracy to democracy. This transition was inevitable, but in the Ardennes, it found dramatic completion. When the last German tanks rolled back toward the Siegfried Line, an entire era rolled back with them. A new era had begun, the American era, the age when world politics was shaped by a nation whose soldiers only yesterday seemed to Europeans like untested amateurs. The irony was that the Germans themselves hastened the process. Their Operation Wacht am Rhein was meant to restore German leadership in Europe. Instead, it handed that leadership to America forever. Looking back at those dramatic days of winter, 1944 to 45, one sees that the Ardennes determined not just the outcome of World War II, but the shape of the century that followed. Patton and his men did more than defeat the German army. They unveiled a new way of thinking, a new culture of warfare, a new method of solving global problems. That legacy endures today. Modern conflicts still echo the principles first applied by Americans in the Ardennes: speed, technological edge, logistical precision, psychological impact. The Battle of the Ardennes changed the face of war forever, and that is its enduring lesson. Was this lesson good for humanity? History has yet to answer, but one thing is beyond doubt. In December 1944, in the Ardennes forests, a new world was born, a world we still live in today. Just 6 o'clock in the morning, June 6, 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel is calmly having breakfast at his home in Herrlingen, nearly 800 kilometers from the beaches of Normandy. His wife, Lucy, has just given him a pair of boots for his 53rd birthday. Within hours, those boots will become the symbol of the greatest strategic mistake in the history of the Third Reich. At that very moment, on the beaches of Normandy, 156,000 Allied soldiers are storming the Atlantic Wall, the system of fortifications Rommel himself once considered impenetrable. The most paradoxical part: the German High Command still has no real grasp of the catastrophe unfolding. According to their intelligence estimates, analytical reports, and calculations, what is happening right now should have been absolutely impossible. Why did the most powerful war machine in the world fail to predict the largest amphibious operation in human history? How did German analysts, with vast intelligence resources at their disposal, miscalculate so disastrously? And what drove the Allies to risk everything for one single day that would change the course of World War II? Spring 1944. Europe has been suffocating under German occupation for 5 years, but the balance of power is shifting. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army has already liberated much of Ukraine and Belarus. In Italy, the Allies are slowly advancing north. Still, everyone understands. Without opening a second front in Western Europe, the war could drag on for years. Planning for Operation Overlord began as early as 1942. British, American, and Canadian strategists studied every kilometer of coastline from Norway to Spain. The challenge wasn't only to find the best landing site. The real task was to convince the Germans that such a place simply didn't exist. Adolf Hitler repeatedly insisted that the Allies would never dare a direct assault on the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall. No rational commander would throw tanks straight at concrete bunkers and minefields, he told his staff at the Wolf's Lair. This conviction became the foundation of German strategy on the Western Front. But what if the Allies weren't as rational as the Germans thought? What if they were willing to attempt the impossible? On June 6, 1944, the world got its answer. When Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall in 1942, the project seemed colossal even by Nazi standards. From the coast of Norway to the Spanish border, a 2,400-kilometer line of fortifications was to be built. The plan called for 15,000 concrete bunkers, 500,000 obstacles on the beaches, and 6.5 million mines. The Todt organization, responsible for construction, mobilized 300,000 workers. Every month, 1,200,000 tons of concrete were poured, more than the entire American construction industry consumed in peacetime. By spring 1944, the Atlantic Wall had swallowed 17 billion Reichsmarks, enough to produce 2,000 Tiger-heavy tanks. Yet behind these impressive figures lay harsh realities. The defenses were uneven, concentrated mainly around large ports. Calais, Dunkirk, and Le Havre received strong garrisons and modern fortifications. Normandy, lying between these strategic points, was comparatively weak. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, openly criticized the concept. "This is not a defensive line, but a propaganda myth," he told his officers. He understood that the real danger wasn't static bunkers, but mobile reserves able to react quickly to any landing. But Hitler trusted in static defense. Scarred by his World War I experience in the trenches, he believed any attack could be repelled with sufficiently strong fortifications. He personally inspected construction, demanding walls up to 3 meters thick. "We are building a fortress that will last 1,000 years, he boasted to journalists. The greatest illusion, however, was the assumption that the Allies would choose the easiest path. German doctrine emphasized economy of force, attack where resistance is weakest. By projecting their own logic onto the enemy, the Germans fell into a trap of their own making. So when the Allies struck directly at Normandy's defenses, the Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was once considered among the best in the world. Led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, it maintained networks across neutral and occupied territories. Yet, at the most critical moment of the war, the system failed. The problem wasn't lack of information, but too much of it, and its misinterpretation. Each day, analysts received hundreds of reports on Allied preparations. Reconnaissance flights recorded troop concentrations in southern England. Radio intercepts picked up surging Allied command activity. Agents reported the construction of specialized landing craft. But every fact could be explained in multiple ways. Allied ships massing in Portsmouth, that could mean Normandy or Calais or even Norway. German intelligence drowned in its own speculation. The Allies exploited this confusion with Operation Fortitude, a massive deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main blow would fall at the Pas de Calais. A fake 1st U.S. Army group under General Patton was stationed in Kent. Wooden tanks, dummy planes, and canvas landing craft created the illusion of a vast army. Radio chatter between non-existent units simulated real preparations. Double agents, controlled by MI5, sent secret reports to Berlin describing an imminent invasion across the Channel's narrowest point. The deception worked. Calais seemed logical. Shortest distance, quick air support, direct route to the Ruhr. Rational arguments all pointed there. So, in spring 1944, when reconnaissance showed intense Allied activity in southern ports, Abwehr analysts concluded it proved their Calais theory. They ignored signs of similar buildups further west, closer to Normandy. Some German officers did suspect the truth. In April 1944, Major Michel of the OKH West Section wrote an analysis naming Normandy as the most likely landing site. His warning, however, was drowned out by the chorus of colleagues convinced of Calais. The result was disastrous. When the first reports of the Normandy landings reached Berlin on June 6th, OKW dismissed them as a diversion. The real attack, they believed, was still coming at Calais. That error cost the Third Reich the war. On June 4th, 1944, Kapitänleutnant Werner Juncker, the Kriegsmarine's chief meteorologist, prepared an ordinary weather forecast for the French coast. His calculations showed that for the next 5 days, the channel would be dominated by a cyclone, strong winds, waves up to 3 meters high, and heavy cloud cover. Conditions for landing operations are extremely unfavorable, he wrote in his final report. This forecast became yet another brick in the wall of German overconfidence. A successful landing required almost perfect weather, light winds for air support, low waves for landing craft, and sufficient visibility for naval artillery. According to every German model, early June 1944 was the worst possible time for a seaborne invasion of such scale. German commanders knew these requirements as well as the Allies. Field Marshal Rundstedt repeatedly emphasized, "The enemy will not attack in a storm. It defies all principles of military science." Even Rommel, usually prepared for worst-case scenarios, decided he could safely leave the front for a few days. But British meteorologists saw something their German colleagues missed. Captain James Stagg's Royal Air Force team spotted a narrow window in the bad weather. Their forecast predicted that on the morning of June 6th, winds would weaken and clouds partially clear. The conditions would be far from perfect, but still acceptable for launching the operation. The difference in forecasts came not only from methodology, but also from access to information. German meteorologists had lost Atlantic weather stations after the Allies secured Greenland and Iceland. British ships and aircraft regularly relayed data from the open ocean, allowing for more accurate predictions of cyclone movements. On the evening of June 5th at 21:15, General Eisenhower held his final conference with his commanders. Captain Stagg reported, "Tomorrow morning, there will be a brief improvement. Winds will drop to 13-18 knots, cloud cover down to 6-7 octas. Not ideal, but conditions are suitable for the operation." The Supreme Commander weighed the risks and gave the order. "We go." Meanwhile, in the headquarters of the German 7th Army at Le Mans, calm prevailed. The latest weather reports confirmed, conditions remained unsuitable for large-scale naval operations. Most staff officers left for leave or training. The Army's commander, General Friedrich Dollmann, prepared for maneuvers in Rennes, 100 kilometers from the coast. Rommel had already departed for Germany on June 4th. Officially, it was for a meeting with Hitler about strengthening Normandy's defenses. Unofficially, it was for his wife's birthday, and in hopes of persuading the Führer to release additional armored reserves. "In this weather, the Allies will never attack," he told his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, before leaving. This misplaced trust in weather forecasts became one of the costliest mistakes of the German High Command. When, on the morning of June 6th, clouds over Normandy did indeed break and winds subsided, German observers could scarcely believe their eyes. By every German calculation, this was impossible. The first reports of improving conditions reached German headquarters only at 5:30 a.m., half an hour after the Allied naval bombardment had already begun. By then, strategic initiative was irretrievably lost. German commanders wasted critical hours trying to understand how the Allies had dared to attack in impossible weather. To grasp the scale of the German error, one must look into the psychology of wartime planning. The German General Staff raised its officers in the traditions of the Prussian school, where logic and rationality were supreme virtues. Every decision was to rest on careful analysis of facts, force ratios, and likely consequences. This system worked brilliantly during the lightning campaigns of 1939-1941. German planners accurately predicted enemy reactions in Poland, France, and in the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. Their ability to think several moves ahead gave the Wehrmacht a decisive edge over less prepared opponents. But by 1944, the same system had become a trap. German analysts were so wedded to their own logic that they could not imagine alternatives. When the Allies acted in ways illogical by German standards, their analysis collapsed. A classic example was the evaluation of Allied air support. German experts correctly calculated that effective air cover for a landing was possible only within 200 kilometers of airfields. Calais was well within range. Normandy was at the very edge. The logical conclusion, the Allies would choose Calais. But the Germans failed to consider that the Allies might willingly accept reduced air efficiency in exchange for strategic surprise. British and American planners deliberately took that risk, choosing a harder option to strike where the enemy least expected it. The same error marked their assessment of logistics. German analysts correctly reasoned that the Allies would need a major port to sustain their forces. The nearest large ports were Calais, Boulogne, and Dunkirk. Therefore, the invasion must aim to seize one of them. Yet the Allies once again broke the rules. Instead of seizing existing ports, they created their own, the famous Mulberry Harbors. Two vast artificial complexes of concrete caissons and floating piers were designed to handle 12,000 tons of cargo per day. To German minds, obsessed with efficiency, the idea seemed absurd. Even when German intelligence reported the mass production of amphibious tanks, floating vehicles, and specialized engineering machines, analysts interpreted them through their own logic. The Allies are preparing for prolonged fighting on the beaches, they concluded. They know they cannot break our defenses quickly, so they are building equipment for a long siege of ports. No one imagined that these innovations were intended for a direct assault on fortified beaches. Tragically, some German officers did sense the danger. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Army Corps defending Normandy, repeatedly warned of a possible surprise landing in his sector. But his voice was drowned out by optimistic forecasts from higher headquarters. The result was unique. German analysts had almost all the facts, yet drew the wrong conclusions. Their logic was flawless, but built on a false assumption that the Allies would think as rationally as the Germans themselves. In the small English town of Dover, directly across from the French coast, lay the Allies' most guarded secret. In a 14th century fortress converted into an underground command post, a group of officers worked on a mission that seemed impossible: to convince German intelligence of the reality of something that did not exist. Operation Fortitude South became the most ambitious deception program in the history of warfare. Its goal was not simply to hide the Allies' real intentions, but to impose a false narrative upon the Germans. British intelligence had to make them believe that the main blow would fall at the Pas de Calais, led by the U.S. First Army Group under General George Patton. Creating the illusion of an entire army was a colossal task. In Kent, a vast stage play unfolded. Hundreds of inflatable Sherman tanks were placed at bases of fictional armored divisions. Wooden replicas of Mustangs and Spitfires filled airfields. Dummy landing craft of plywood gave the appearance of a vast naval buildup. The hardest part was fabricating radio traffic. A team of 300 operators transmitted non-stop chatter between imaginary units. 2nd Armored Division requests clearance to move. 79th Infantry Regiment reports loading complete. Air Group Alpha ready for takeoff. German intercept stations picked up thousands of such messages every day. Double agents, controlled by MI5, played a decisive role. Chief among them was Spaniard Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the Germans as Arabelle and to the British as Garbo. A gifted actor, he conjured up in his German handlers' minds an entire network of 24 sub-agents across Britain. Garbo regularly sent detailed reports to Madrid, then on to Berlin, describing the preparations of the fictitious U.S. First Army Group. He witnessed tanks being loaded in Dover, received confidential tips from an American officer in a London pub, tracked troop movements with the help of his Welsh assistant. None of these people existed, but the Germans paid him $20,000 a month for his priceless intelligence. The deception reached its peak in May 1944, when Garbo reported Patton's appointment to command the First Army Group. Other sources confirmed it, including intercepted phone calls and accidental mentions in the American press. For German intelligence, this was conclusive proof. the Allies' main strike would come at Calais. Patton himself played the role to perfection. The most famous American general made frequent appearances in Kent, inspecting dummy tanks, giving speeches to imaginary troops. German reconnaissance planes photographed him, reinforcing the illusion of a massive buildup. The Allies even created a believable logistical picture. They organized fake deliveries of fuel, ammunition, and food for a supposed 150,000-man force. Warehouses in Kent were filled with empty crates and barrels. Trains shuttled between supply bases and troop positions, creating the illusion of intense activity. The results exceeded all expectations. By June 1944, German High Command was convinced that 89 Allied divisions were massed in the Pas de Calais, when in fact, not a single one was there. So when the Normandy landings began on June 6th, Hitler and his generals dismissed them as a diversion. The real attack, they believed, was still to come at Calais, led by Patton's Phantom Army. This error cost the Germans not only strategic initiative, but also the chance to react effectively to the real threat. While they waited for the main assault, the Allies secured the beaches of Normandy, creating a foothold that could no longer be dislodged. 6 o'clock in the morning, June 6th, 1944. At La Roche-Guyon Castle, nestled in the scenic valley of the Seine, some 70 kilometers from Paris, a telephone shattered the pre-dawn quiet. General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, snatched up the receiver on the second ring. Years of war had trained him to react instantly to urgent calls. "General, this is Major Pluscat from the 352nd Division," came a trembling voice. "An enemy fleet is approaching our shores, hundreds of ships. This is not an exercise." A cold wave rose in Speidel's throat, but the seasoned staff officer stayed calm. Exactly how many ships? What types? Where? For the next 15 minutes, the phones did not stop. Reports poured in from across Normandy. Landing craft off Omaha Beach, paratroopers over Sainte-Mère-Église, naval gunfire near Carentan. Each message added detail to a picture that seemed unbelievable. At 6:30, Speidel convened an emergency conference of Army Group B. In a grand hall hung with portraits of French kings, 20 of Germany's most experienced officers gathered. On a huge map of northern France, red circles marked enemy landings. The picture was staggering. "Gentlemen," Speidel began, "we are facing a major operation by the enemy in Normandy. Preliminary data suggests over 1,000 ships and around 100,000 troops are involved." Tension thickened. Colonel Anton Staubwasser, Chief of Intelligence, spoke first. "This could be a diversion. Our sources in England still confirm preparations for the main operation at the Pas de Calais." A debate erupted that would shape the day. Some demanded throwing every reserve at Normandy immediately. Others insisted on holding back forces to repel the real attack at Calais. Speidel faced the hardest decision of his career. The decisive factor was Rommel's absence. The veteran field commander, who had battled the British for years in Africa, might have judged the scale of the threat better than anyone. But the Desert Fox was 800 kilometers from the front, breakfasting with his wife in Herrlingen. Speidel balked at trusting his own intuition. At 7:15, a report arrived that further muddied the waters. Radio intercepts detected stepped-up Allied transmissions around Dover, the supposed base of Patton's fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group. "That confirms our assessment," Staubwasser declared. "Normandy is a feint. Patton is preparing the main blow." In reality, the Allies had deliberately spiked radio traffic in Kent to sustain the illusion of an impending Calais assault. German analysts, however, took the deception as confirmation of their own theories. The logic felt airtight, a pinning attack in Normandy to draw reserves, clearing the way for Patton's main strike. The most tragic decision came from Lieutenant General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, the strongest mobile formation in Normandy. Receiving orders at 6:45 to move to the coast, he delayed for 2 critical hours, waiting for clarification from higher headquarters. "This may be a false alarm," the seasoned tanker reasoned. "We shouldn't give away our positions over panicky reports." At 9 o'clock, when Feuchtinger finally received a direct order to attack, his tanks ran into Allied air power. Without air cover, columns of Panthers and Tigers became easy prey for Typhoons and Thunderbolts. In 2 hours, the division lost 40% of its vehicles, never reaching the battlefield. At 10:30, La Roche-Guyon received a call from Berlin. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of the OKW operations staff, relayed the official line. The operation in Normandy is a diversion. Preserve main forces to repel the principal attack at the Pas de Calais. That decision froze German defenses in place. While commanders argued about Allied intentions, American, British, and Canadian troops were entrenching on the Norman beaches, turning tactical surprise into a strategic advantage that could no longer be undone. When Allied naval guns opened fire at 5:30 on June 6th, soldiers of the German 352nd Infantry Division in the bunkers above Omaha Beach at first took it for another drill. In recent months, such bombardments had become routine. British and American ships had repeatedly shelled the coast, testing German defenses and gathering intelligence. Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter of the 726th Regiment climbed to the observation post of Strong Point WN-72 and raised his binoculars. On the horizon, he saw a few ship silhouettes, nothing unusual for recent weeks. But as the morning sun burned off the sea haze, Richter froze in horror. The water to the horizon was carpeted with hundreds of vessels of every type and size. "Mein Gott, das ist unmöglich," he cried, grabbing the phone. The line to regimental headquarters had been cut by the preliminary bombardment. He dispatched a runner, 3 kilometers across ground raked by shellfire. Crucial information reached command a half-hour late. Similar scenes unfolded along the entire Norman coast. Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Koenig, a battalion commander in the Utah Beach sector, initially refused to believe his subordinates' reports. "This cannot be the main attack," he assured himself. "Logic dictates the enemy must strike at the Pas de Calais." Only when paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd Airborne began seizing bridges in his rear did Koenig grasp the scale of the disaster. The most dramatic situation developed at the 84th Army Corps headquarters in Saint-Lô. General Erich Marx, one of the few German commanders who had foreseen a Normandy attack, was preparing to take part in war games at Rennes. When the first landing reports reached him at 6 o'clock, he immediately canceled everything and returned to his command post. But correct assessment could not make up for a lack of resources. Marx had only 3 infantry divisions stretched over a 100-kilometer front. The Mobile Reserve, the 21st Panzer Division, was under direct Army Group control and could not be committed without Rommel's approval or that of his deputy. "I need tanks now!" Marx shouted into the phone to La Roche-Guyon. Speidel hedged. "We are analyzing the situation. It may be a diversion. Await orders." Every minute of delay cost the Germans dozens of dead and lost positions. Worst of all was the failure to move information up the chain quickly. A communication system that worked tolerably well for static defense proved useless in crisis. Reports climbed 5 rungs of command: battalion to regiment, regiment to division, division to corps, corps to army, army to army group, each level layered on its own interpretation, often distorting the original. By the time a field report of a limited landing of 2,000 to 3,000 troops near Carentan reached Berlin, it had become a localized diversionary raid using airborne units. The true scale vanished in the maze of staff bureaucracy. The most tragic symbol of the chaos was the fate of Major Werner Pluskat of the 352nd, the very officer who first reported the approaching Allied fleet. After hours of heavy fighting, his bunker was outflanked by American troops. When Pluskat called headquarters one last time, they asked, "What is your situation?" "The situation?" he replied with bitter irony. "The situation is this. The Yanks are in my bunker courtyard throwing grenades through the window. Is that clear enough?" Minutes later, the line went dead forever. Pluskat fell, defending a position the German High Command still deemed secondary. By noon, even the most optimistic analysts conceded the reality. Over 150,000 Allied troops had landed along a 60-kilometer stretch of coast. This was no diversion. It was the largest amphibious operation in human history. The realization came too late. Strategic initiative was gone for good. 10 o'clock in the morning, the Rommel residence at Herrlingen. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in civilian clothes, leisurely unwrapped his wife's gifts: elegant handmade leather boots and a silver cigarette case engraved for his 53rd birthday. After months of grinding work on the Atlantic Wall, the day promised a quiet family celebration. The 10:15 phone call changed the mood instantly. Lucy Rommel watched her husband's face harden, from relaxed smile to the focused intensity of a veteran soldier. On the line was General Speidel with alarming news of a large-scale landing in Normandy. How many divisions? Rommel's first question was purely practical. Preliminary estimate, 6 to 8 divisions plus airborne, Speidel answered. Where are our tanks? The 21st Panzer is moving, but its attack is delayed by airstrikes. The 12th SS Panzer Division has orders to remain in reserve. A cold knot formed in Rommel's stomach, the same sensation that had accompanied the critical moments of the African campaign. If the Allies had put 6 to 8 divisions ashore at once, this was no feint. It was the main operation, and it was likely to succeed. I'm returning immediately, Rommel said, hanging up. Lucy knew that tone. The family celebration was over. 20 minutes later, the field marshal was in his Horsch 853A, heading north at 120 kilometers per hour. His driver, Obergefreiter Karl Daniel, received crisp orders. La Roche-Guyon, maximum speed, stops only for fuel. The drive from Herrlingen to Army Group B normally took 12 hours. This day, Allied fighter bombers patrolled every major road, hunting German staff cars. The route forced detours along back roads and frequent dashes into woods whenever enemy aircraft appeared. Each stop brought worse news. In Metz, Rommel learned that the Americans had taken Sainte-Mère-Église. In Reims, of British gains at Sword Beach. Near Château-Thierry, of Canadian landings at Juno. The mosaic of disaster filled in, piece by piece. Most painful was the realization of his own misjudgment. Only 3 days earlier, he had personally inspected the Normandy defenses and left satisfied. If the Allies try to land here, we'll turn the beaches into their grave, he told divisional commanders. Now, those words felt like cruel irony. At 1600, passing through Chartres, Rommel stopped at a phone booth and called his staff. Speidel reported the latest. The Allies were firmly ashore on all beaches, had taken several towns, and were linking their bridgeheads. German counterattacks had failed under Allied air supremacy. Why have the Panzer reserves not been committed? Rommel exploded. The Führer forbids employing Panzer divisions without his personal authorization, Speidel replied. High Command still believes Normandy is a diversion. Rommel slammed his fist into the booth. Every hour of delay cost Germany thousands of men and miles of coastline. At 1830, Rommel's Horsch finally rolled through the gates of La Roche-Guyon. He leapt out before the driver could open the door and sprinted to the operations room. On the large map of Normandy, red arrows marked Allied penetrations. Blue crosses marked lost German positions. The picture was grim. How many men have we lost? He asked first. Preliminary figures, about 4,000 killed and wounded, another 2,000 missing, Speidel answered. And the Allies? No exact numbers, but their losses are far lower. Rommel nodded darkly. In North Africa, that ratio had always meant a lost battle. Worst of all, the critical hours were gone. While the German command argued over Allied intentions, those Allies had secured their positions, built up strength, and prepared to push inland. The chance to smash the landing in the water, the only realistic way to repulse the invasion, was gone forever. We lost this battle before it began, Rommel said quietly, staring at the map. The words became an epitaph for Germany's defense of Western Europe. Wolf's Lair, Rastenburg, East Prussia. When, at 9 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, Hitler's adjutant woke him with news of the Normandy landings, the Führer at first reacted with near relief. "At last!" he exclaimed as he dressed quickly. "Now we know where they will try to attack. I always said Rommel is too pessimistic about our defensive capabilities." His initial judgment was predictable. This was a diversion designed to pull German reserves away from the Pas de Calais, where the real battle would unfold. Hitler summoned Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of the OKW operations staff, and categorically forbade moving panzer divisions from the 15th Army guarding the Calais sector. Churchill and Roosevelt think themselves very clever, Hitler mused at the morning briefing. They want to force us to shift everything to Normandy, and then Patton's army will deliver the real blow. But I can see through their game. No one dared contradict him, though some already doubted the assessment. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Army Group B reported that the Allies had landed at least 80,000 men and were still building up. Studying the map, Hitler concluded, too little for a main operation. Eisenhower's real strength is still in England. When Jodl cautiously proposed allowing Rommel to use the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Hitler curtly refused. The most dramatic moment came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when Rommel called personally from his headquarters. The Desert Fox, just back at La Roche-Guyon, pleaded for permission to counterattack immediately with all available forces. "My Führer, every hour of delay favors the enemy," he urged. "If we do not destroy them today, tomorrow it will be impossible." Hitler listened with visible impatience. "Rommel, you have always been a pessimist," he replied coldly. This is a local operation meant to draw off our reserves. The real attack will be at the Pas de Calais. I order the panzer divisions to be preserved for the main blow." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Hitler would not waste time on secondary matters. By evening, the picture began to change. At 8 o'clock in the evening, a Ju-88 reconnaissance aircraft delivered photographs of Allied positions in Normandy. Hundreds of landing craft, tanks, artillery, and field works visible on all captured beaches. The scale was obvious even to the most prejudiced analysts. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, dared to voice doubts. "My Führer, perhaps we should reconsider. The enemy has landed substantial forces and clearly intends to stay." Hitler flared. "Guderian, have you also fallen for British trickery? This is elementary deception." Worse, Hitler began searching for culprits in the failed repulse of the landing. Why did Rommel not destroy them in the water? Why did we build the Atlantic Wall? Why is our Air Force not striking their ships? Each question betrayed a fundamental misunderstanding of the front's reality. SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison at headquarters, tried to explain the air situation. "My Führer, Luftflotte 3 can muster at most 300 aircraft, while the Allies have over 5,000 over the battlefield." Hitler waved it aside. "Numbers can deceive. One German pilot is worth 5 Englishmen." By midnight it was clear, the Allies not only held their bridgeheads, they were expanding them. The Americans had pushed up to 8 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach. The British had taken Bayeux. The Canadians were secure near Courseulles-sur-Mer. This no longer looked like a diversion. Nevertheless, Hitler clung to his version. At 11:30 at night, he summoned Intelligence Chief Colonel Alexis Baron von Rohen. "Where is Patton's army? When does the real attack begin?" Von Rohen answered cautiously, "Our information suggests the 1st U.S. Army Group remains concentrated around Dover. They may be awaiting developments in Normandy." "Exactly," Hitler cried triumphantly. "They are waiting for us to commit everything against their bait. I will not be deceived." That decision, to hold the main reserves for the real attack, sealed the fate of Germany's western defense. While Hitler played chess with a phantom opponent, the real enemy consolidated on French soil. June 7th, the second day after the landings. On the maps of the German General Staff, the situation looked less catastrophic than first reports suggested. The Allies held 5 relatively small bridgeheads, none deeper than 10 kilometers. A 3-kilometer gap still existed between the Omaha and Gold sectors, and the Germans controlled it. In theory, the landing could still be crushed. Lieutenant General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, spent a sleepless night planning a counterattack. His Panthers and Tigers, despite air losses, remained combat-ready. With help from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division, he aimed to split the British beachhead and reach the sea. Feuchtinger's plan was simple and logical: a simultaneous strike by 2 Panzer divisions from Caen to the coast to separate British and Canadian forces. If Bayeux could be seized and the British 3rd Division cut off, an evacuation of the entire sector might be forced, allowing a shift of focus against the Americans. But execution proved impossible due to command contradictions. The 12th SS reported directly to High Command and could not be used without Hitler's personal approval. Feuchtinger appealed to Speidel, Speidel to Jodl, Jodl to Hitler. Each rung added a delay of 2 to 3 hours. When authorization finally arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June 7th, the moment for an effective counterstrike was gone. The British had landed more reinforcements, emplaced anti-tank guns, and organized defenses in key villages. Instead of a surprise blow against a shaken enemy, the Germans had to attack prepared positions. The most dramatic local action came the evening near Villers-Bocage. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, Germany's top-scoring tank ace, drove his Tiger deep into British lines and, in 15 minutes, knocked out 11 Cromwell tanks and 13 armored carriers. But this tactical triumph could not change the overall battle. Another missed chance was the failure to exploit panic among parts of the Allied troops. The U.S. 1st Division, mauled on Omaha Beach, was near demoralization. General Omar Bradley seriously considered evacuating the sector if the position could not be stabilized. German scouts recorded signs of panic, disorganized withdrawals by small groups, seeking cover instead of digging in. A high rate of non-fatal sanitary casualties. A resolute commander might have turned this into a decisive counterattack. But General Dietrich Kreis of the 352nd Division lacked reserves to exploit any local success. Painfully, the technical means to disrupt the landing did exist. German long-range artillery could reach every beach. The 155mm guns at Merville-sur-Orne regularly blanketed Sword. 210mm mortars near Grand Camp could hit Omaha. But there was no coordination across services. The Luftwaffe retained some capacity for night strikes. Colonel General Hugo Sperrely's Luftflotte 3 had roughly 500 aircraft in northern France, including the new Me-262 jets, yet fuel shortages limited sorties, and the lack of veteran pilots made each mission risky. The greatest lost opportunity was the failure to disrupt Allied logistics. The Mulberry artificial harbors, which the British began assembling on June 8th, were extremely vulnerable in their first days. A sabotage effort might have paralyzed Allied supply for weeks, but the Kriegsmarine could not operate in daylight under Allied air supremacy. Type 7. U-boats from Brittany ports were ineffective in Normandy's shallow waters. E-boats, S-booty, suffered heavy losses to RAF Typhoons. By June 10th, the critical window had closed. The Allies had linked their beachheads into a continuous defensive line 80 kilometers long. German counterattacks could no longer reach the sea. The battle for the bridgeheads was lost. Now began the Battle of Normandy, where the balance of power would shift further toward the Allies with each passing day. In an underground bunker near Cherbourg, Captain Günther Feucht studied the latest take from intercept station Medved 7. In the last 3 months, his team had logged over 50,000 Allied transmissions, analyzed frequencies, signal strength, transmitter schedules, yet none of it helped predict the catastrophe of June 6th. The issue was not a lack of technical means, but misinterpretation. German intercept sites had recorded a sharp rise in radio activity in southern England since April 1944. Analysts assumed this meant preparations for a Pas-de-Calais operation. The shortest channel crossing required intense coordination. In reality, the Allies were manufacturing that picture. British and American operators sent fictitious traffic around the clock, simulating corps and divisions that did not exist. The system was so elaborate that many Allied officers themselves did not know its full scope. A major technical shortcoming was failing to grasp the true scale of Allied air power. Würzburg radar stations routinely picked up large formations over the channel, but command read them as routine patrols. No one imagined the Allies could put 11,000 combat aircraft aloft at once. Feucht repeatedly reported anomalies. On the night of June 6th, his station detected a powerful surge on frequencies typically used to coordinate airborne drops. This may indicate a large operation with paratroopers, he wrote in a 0230 urgent message. But the warning drowned in similar signals. For months, the Allies had run exercises with fake airborne radio nets. German analysts were conditioned to false alarms and discounted them. When the real operation began, it looked like just another drill. Aerial reconnaissance also failed. The last successful German photo recon over southern England was on June 3, 1944. Oberleutnant Klaus Hagen's BF-109 photographed Portsmouth and Southampton, but could not cover the entire concentration area. The images showed roughly 200 vessels, significant but not decisive. Hagen did not know the same buildups existed in dozens of other ports from Falmouth to Harwich. The total Allied fleet exceeded 7,000 ships, the largest armada in history. Especially fateful was missing the Mulberry harbors. British engineers worked in extreme secrecy, using closed docks and camouflage sites. German agents reported unusual construction on the Thames, but could not identify the purpose of the mysterious concrete structures. When the first Mulberry components appeared off Normandy on June 8th, German observers did not grasp their significance. "The Allies are towing some pontoons," they reported. Only days later did it become clear. The enemy was building its own ports, freeing itself from reliance on captured French harbors. The most painful technical error was underestimating Allied electronic warfare. German radars were regularly jammed by unknown signals, written off as atmospheric or mechanical glitches. In fact, the British employed a sophisticated jamming network that blinded German air defenses at the critical moment. Operation Mandrel used specially equipped Halifax aircraft to jam German sets at around 125 MHz. Operation Carpet employed clouds of aluminum foil strips, window chaff, to create false echoes. Operation Titanic simulated large airborne drops far from the real landing zones. The result was unique. The German surveillance system functioned, but fed headquarters a distorted reality. Radar operators saw hundreds of returns, yet could not distinguish real aircraft from ghosts. Intercept stations logged thousands of signals, most of them deception. Vaught later wrote in his memoirs, "We had the best equipment, the most seasoned operators, the most modern methods. But the enemy beat us not technologically, but psychologically. He made us see what we wanted to see and miss what was truly happening." In Britain's secret workshops, a weapon the Germans could scarcely imagine was taking shape over 2 years. Not tanks or aircraft in the conventional sense, but specialized machines with a single purpose: to make the impossible possible, to let infantry and armor assault fortified beaches and survive the inferno. Major General Percy Hobart, an eccentric British engineer, led the development of what the Allies nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, a collection of peculiar vehicles, each designed to solve a specific problem of amphibious assault. German analysts who intercepted mentions of these toys did not take them seriously. That was one of the costliest misjudgments of the war. The Sherman DD, a swimming tank, struck the Germans as a technical oddity. How could a 30-ton machine stay afloat on canvas pontoons? Yet on June 6th, these impossible tanks surged out of the surf onto Gold and Utah beaches, delivering the critical early fire support that infantry desperately needed. The Sherman Crab, with flails in place of a gun, beat paths through minefields for the following troops. The Churchill Havre, mounting a 290mm spigot mortar, could blast concrete casemates with a single shot. The Churchill Crocodile, with a flamethrower effective out to 120 meters, compelled bunker garrisons to abandon positions without a fight. The biggest surprise was the Bridge Layer family, massive 25-ton portable spans carried by tanks and dropped across anti-tank ditches. German engineers assumed that overcoming such obstacles would take hours. In reality, British armor was crossing them in minutes. But the most ingenious innovation was the Mulberry artificial harbors. All German strategy rested on the premise that the Allies must seize a major port to sustain an invasion. Accordingly, the strongest garrison sat at Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, places deemed essential to Allied success. British engineers defied that logic. If you cannot capture a port quickly, build your own. Project Mulberry called for 2 artificial harbors, each rated at 7,000 tons of cargo per day, comparable to a large pre-war port. The scale was staggering even by British standards: 600,000 tons of concrete and steel, 70 concrete caissons as tall as a 5-story building, and 60 aging ships to be scuttled as breakwaters. Construction took a year and a half under strict secrecy. German agents reported unusual activity in British docks, but never divined the purpose. No less revolutionary was Pluto, the undersea pipeline across the Channel. While Germans expected the Allies to capture fuel depots and ports, the British laid their own artery, delivering petrol directly from England. Its capacity could fuel 2 million soldiers per day. Another breakthrough was the mass use of radar to control naval gunfire. Allied ships carried 698 radar sets of various types, from navigation to gunnery control. German coastal batteries, reliant on visual spotting, were helpless against an opponent who could shoot accurately in any weather. Tactics were transformed by specialized landing craft. LSTs, landing ship tank, could disgorge 20 tanks at a time. LCIs, landing craft infantry, put 200 soldiers ashore in a single lift. LCTs, landing craft tank, brought heavy equipment straight onto the sand. The Allies' total lift equaled 47 divisions, more than the entire German invasion army of 1940. Equally stunning was the use of parachute delivery for heavy equipment. After American paratroopers seized bridges near Sainte-Mère-Église, 105mm howitzers descended to support them on special parachutes. German commanders could hardly believe airborne troops possessed their own artillery. The most demoralizing innovation was the widespread use of napalm. When U.S. thunderbolts drenched German positions with a jelly-like fire that could not be extinguished, the psychological effect outweighed the physical damage. Many soldiers abandoned positions without having been directly hit. The technological revolution expanded the possibilities of offensive warfare. What had seemed impossible a year earlier, storming fortified beaches without first seizing ports, became reality through Allied engineering, genius, and industrial might. Germany lost not only a battle of minds, but a race of technologies. June 12, 1944. In the underground bunker of the 7th Army headquarters at Le Mans, words could scarcely capture the mood. Red symbols on operational maps showed the scope of disaster. The Allies held a coastal strip 100 kilometers wide and up to 20 deep. German losses had exceeded 40,000 men in 6 days. General Friedrich Dollmann, the army commander, sat at his desk mechanically scanning reports that brought no good news. In the last 24 hours, the Americans had taken Carentan, linking the Omaha and Utah beachheads. The British massed over 300 tanks near Caen for a strike at Normandy's key city. The Canadians prepared to storm the Carpiquet airfield. Worst was the sense of helplessness. Every counterattack shattered on Allied air superiority. German tanks could not move by day under constant typhoon and thunderbolt strikes. Reinforcements crept to the front only at night along back roads, bleeding precious time and men. "We are fighting an enemy with 10 times our equipment," Dollmann told his chief of staff, Colonel Karl von Tempelhof. "Our soldiers fight bravely, but courage cannot compensate for such imbalance." In 6 days, the Luftwaffe flew just 319 combat sorties against 14,674 by Allied air forces. Lieutenant General Edgar Feuchtinger's 21st Panzer Division lost 60% of its vehicles in a week. His Tigers and Panthers, fearsome in defense, proved helpless against Allied methods. The enemy refused tank duels. He called in air or artillery and methodically destroyed German armor from safe distances. "This is not war. It is slaughter," Feuchtinger wrote in his diary. "We may knock out 10 of their tanks, but tomorrow they bring 20 more. We lose one and have nothing to replace it." Allied industrial power rendered any German tactical success meaningless. Rank-and-file soldiers felt the pressure most. Obergefreiter Hans Steiner of the 352nd Division wrote to his wife, "The sky above us is always full of enemy aircraft. They shoot at anything that moves. Even a courier on a bicycle draws machine gun fire. It feels like they have limitless ammunition." The relentless naval bombardment was especially demoralizing. German troops in trenches felt the earth shudder under 16-inch battleship shells. Before each assault, the roar of thousands of engines drowned even nearby explosions. "It seems the whole world has turned against us," noted Lieutenant Kurt Meyer in his diary. Mid-level commanders began to lose faith in defense. Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig König reported, "Morale is degrading sharply. Men see an unending flow of enemy equipment and lose hope. Desertion increases by the day." In a week, the 84th Corps listed 6,000 men missing. Many simply left their posts. The harshest realization struck analysts on June 15th, when intelligence tallied Allied buildup rates. Each day the enemy landed 20 to 25,000 soldiers and 3 to 4,000 tons of materiel. At that pace, more than 1 million Allied servicemen would be in Normandy by month's end. German capacity to resist this tide was meager. The 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais still could not move because of Hitler's ban. Reserves from Germany crawled westward over rail lines shattered by Allied air. Every train bound for Normandy lost 20 to 30% of its load to bombing. The symbol of the psychological break was Dahlmann himself. On the evening of June 28th, after another grim conference with Rommel about the collapsing defense, the 61-year-old Army commander died of a heart attack. Officially, heart failure, but everyone understood. The general succumbed to the pressure of looming defeat. "We are not fighting an army, but the industrial power of a continent," Rommel told Dahlmann at their last meeting. "Against such strength, even the best soldiers in the world are helpless." With those words, the Desert Fox summed up Germany's illusions about repulsing the Allied landing. By late June 1944, it was clear. The German misreading of the Allied landing site would have consequences far beyond a single battle. What first appeared as a tactical surprise had become a strategic catastrophe, shaping the outcome of the entire European war. The most obvious result was the inability to stabilize the Western Front. By July 1st, the Allies had landed 850,000 soldiers, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies in Normandy. This force equaled the entire German invasion army of Poland in 1939, but with incomparably superior equipment. Against it, the Germans could muster only 300,000 men of the 7th Army, demoralized by weeks of heavy fighting and deprived of adequate air and artillery support. A 3-to-1 balance in the Allies' favor made continued defense only a matter of time. Each day of delay worsened the German position. Strategically, the more important consequence was the dispersion of German reserves between two fronts. Hitler kept the 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais, even after it was obvious no real attack would come there. 20 divisions, nearly 400,000 men, idled while their comrades died in Normandy. The error cascaded onto the Eastern Front. The crisis in Normandy forced German command to shift several panzer divisions west from Army Group Center. Just as the Red Army launched Operation Bagration on June 23, 1944, its most successful offensive of the war, in 3 weeks Soviet forces advanced 450 kilometers, liberated Belarus, and virtually annihilated Army Group Center. 28 German divisions ceased to exist as organized formations. Losses reached 350,000, more than at Stalingrad. Germany now faced 2 active fronts with insufficient reserves to hold either. The economic impact was equally ruinous. The Normandy bridgehead became a base for systematically wrecking German war industry. Flying fortresses and liberators that had flown from Britain now could operate from French airfields, halving distances to targets. By August 1944, the effect was stark. Aviation fuel output fell to 10% of January levels. Tank factories ran at 30% capacity for lack of alloy steels. Munitions production dropped by half. The Reich's war machine began to choke on shortages. The political shock was even greater. Failure in Normandy shattered Hitler's prestige among senior officers. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate the Führer. Though the Wolf's Lair bomb failed to kill him, it proved that even the most loyal had lost faith in victory. Rommel, wounded on July 17th, was later implicated in the plot. On October 14th, the Desert Fox chose suicide over a show trial. The death of Germany's most popular general became a symbol of a regime collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. Most tragic were the humanitarian consequences. Recognizing defeat's inevitability, the Nazi apparatus accelerated its most brutal programs. Deportations to death camps tripled. From June to December 1944, more civilians died than in any comparable span of the war. Inside Germany, terror intensified against any hint of dissent. In the second half of 1944, more citizens were executed for undermining the war effort than in all prior war years combined. The dying regime turned ever more vicious against its own people. By year's end, the verdict was undeniable. One strategic mistake, misreading the place and nature of the Allied landing, had broken German strategy entirely. The Third Reich, proclaimed to last 1,000 years, began to crumble under the weight of its miscalculations and illusions. In the wartime memoirs of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, there is a modest paragraph that reveals the true nature of the Allied victory in Normandy. "We did not defeat the Germans because we were cleverer," he wrote. "We won because we were able to think differently from what they expected." That sentence holds the key to understanding one of history's greatest strategic defeats. Operation Overlord was a triumph less of military craft than of creative thought. The Allies deliberately rejected the correct solutions in military terms and chose a path that would have seemed senseless to any seasoned commander. Assault fortified beaches instead of bypassing them. Build your own ports instead of seizing existing ones. Use paratroopers as heavy infantry. Each of these choices flew in the face of the textbooks. General Bernard Montgomery, commander of Allied ground forces, later explained, "The Germans prepared to fight a rational opponent. We decided to be irrational wherever it gave us an advantage." This counter-logic became the philosophical foundation of the entire operation. Nowhere was it clearer than in the beach tactics. German fortifications were designed on the assumption that attackers would seek the weakest points. Instead, the Allies often struck the strongest positions, using engineering and firepower to crack what seemed impregnable. On Omaha Beach, U.S. Rangers scaled the 30-meter cliffs of Pointe du Hoc under German artillery fire. Militarily, it bordered on suicide. But that very foolishness produced tactical success. The Germans did not expect an attack there and had not prepared adequate defenses. British engineers built tanks that violated every principle of armored warfare. The Sherman DD sacrificed protection for buoyancy. The Churchill AVRE sacrificed speed for crushing firepower. The Sherman Crab sacrificed its gun for mine-clearing flails. Each machine was wrong by classical doctrine, yet perfect for its specific task. The most brilliant achievement was the psychological dimension of Operation Fortitude. British intelligence did not merely deceive the Germans, it weaponized their own logic against them. By conjuring Patton's fictitious army, the Allies knew the Germans would be compelled to believe in the most logical plan of attack. The double agent Garbo mastered this duel of minds. His reports were persuasive precisely because they told the Germans what they already wanted to hear. "The best way to deceive the enemy," one MI5 chief later said, "is to tell him what he already believes." Equally telling was the German High Command's reaction to the real landings. Even as facts pointed to a major operation in Normandy, analysts kept filtering evidence through their preconceived expectations. Psychologists would call it cognitive dissonance, the inability to absorb information that contradicts entrenched beliefs. The roots lay deeper in German military culture. The Prussian school trained officers to think in categories of efficiency, economy of force, and rational planning. Those principles yielded the victories of 1939 to 1941, but became a trap when facing an antagonist willing to act illogically. The Allies grasped this intuitively. American military culture favored direct solutions even at higher cost. The British tradition prized unorthodox approaches and technical innovation. Combined, these created a synergy the Germans failed to anticipate. Paradoxically, German commanders were no less gifted than their foes. Rommel, Rundstedt, Guderian, all had shown brilliance elsewhere, but they operated within a system that did not permit radically unconventional choices. The result? A more experienced and technically proficient side lost to a less experienced but more creative one. Overlord proved that, in war as in art, rules sometimes exist to be broken. The Allies won because they dared to think beyond familiar frames. Evening, May 8, 1945, the day of the Third Reich's capitulation. In shattered Berlin, amid the smoking ruins of the 1,000-year empire, former Colonel Alexis Baron von Roane leafs through intelligence archives salvaged from the Abwehr's basements. Among the hundreds of folders, he finds one labeled Assessment of Allied Invasion Plans, April 1944. Reading his own year-old memoranda, von Roane feels a bitterness heavier than pain. Every conclusion seemed logical, every forecast justified, every recommendation sound. Yet the outcome was catastrophic. How could Europe's most qualified analysts be so completely wrong? The answer lies not in incompetence, but in human cognition. German intelligence fell prey to what psychologists would later call confirmation bias, the tendency to seek facts that support our prior beliefs and filter out those that contradict them. When all indicators pointed to the Pas de Calais, analysts unconsciously discarded information about Normandy. This tragedy of thought had planetary consequences. A single misreading of enemy intent precipitated a regime's collapse, the deaths of millions, and a remade map of Europe. Had the Germans correctly anticipated the landing site, the history of World War II, and perhaps the entire 20th century might have unfolded differently. Could the mistake have been avoided? The record shows the Allies spent 2 years and vast resources to make the Germans err. Operation Fortitude was a masterpiece of deception that used German analytical methods against them. British services studied how their adversaries thought and then constructed a reality perfectly aligned with those expectations. Here lies the deepest irony of the Normandy disaster. The Germans did not lose because their intelligence was poor. It was too good. The analytical machine worked flawlessly, but on corrupted inputs. When your enemy controls the data, the best methods become a trap. Most painful for German commanders was realizing they might have beaten the landing had they grasped its true scale and location. The 21st and 12th Panzer Divisions, deployed directly in Normandy, could have smashed the invaders in the surf, but those forces were dispersed because the enemy's plans were misread. After his wounding, Rommel spent the war's last months at home and left a bitter note. "We lost this war in our staff rooms, not on the battlefields. Our logic was impeccable, but it rested on false assumptions. A commander's deadliest enemy is not hostile guns, but his own certainty." For the Allies, Overlord was not only a military triumph, but proof of the power of creative thought. The British plan, leveraging American industry, Soviet pressure in the East, and their own ingenuity, produced a synergy no one foresaw. Eisenhower later wrote, "We prevailed not by strength alone, but by surprise, not by mere intellect, but by the courage to think differently." The paradox is that both sides acted rationally within their mental frameworks. The Germans applied proven planning methods. The Allies broke the rules, deliberately and systematically. The result shows that in total war, victory belongs not to those who best follow the rules, but to those who dare to write new ones. Nearly 80 years on, Overlord still warns against intellectual overconfidence. In a world of ever-growing information and ever-doubtful reliability, Normandy's lessons endure. The gravest error is the certainty that we have correctly understood others' intentions. Perhaps the true tragedy of June 6, 1944, is not that the Germans failed to repel the landing, but that they failed to believe in the possibility of the impossible. And it is precisely such belief that the impossible may be possible that separates victors from the defeated in history's most critical moments. Are we ready today to admit that our deepest convictions might be wrong? Can we perceive what does not fit our expectations? The answers to those questions will shape not only our personal fates, but the future of a civilization living in a world of mounting uncertainty and unpredictability.